I'm Cliff Ribner, and I'm going to talk to you today about the incredibly stupid and destructive and Marxist, that's what they are, policies that have been followed by the federal government regarding farming. All of our food comes from farms. That's where it comes from. It's not magically created by the government or anything else. And the federal government had no involvement whatsoever. There was nothing until 1862 when they formed the Agriculture Department. Now, at that time, they knew that the federal government could not get involved in telling farmers what to do. So all the Agriculture Department originally was, they did research, wasting taxpayer money on that stuff instead of letting we had agriculture colleges in the country that did plenty of research, and we didn't need them. Anyway, it was basically pretty innocuous. Until 1906, when a bunch of communists in the Agriculture Department, they'd been advocating for years to have some kind of power over the food and drugs in the country. They wanted to have power because they were communists, and that's what communists want. They want power in the government over the citizens. They view the citizens as being corrupt and stupid, and they pretend that bureaucrats in the government are brilliant, never make a mistake, and completely selfless. It's all total nonsense. And particularly, they view businesses as being evil and corrupt. They make all their money by stealing from their customers and their employees. And basically, they want to kill all their customers and take advantage of their employees. So the government has to get involved to stop that. That's what they actually believe. They don't believe in anything like market forces. Market forces are a real thing. And there are two things that control how businesses operate and which guarantee that they have every incentive not to harm their customers or their employees and to do everything they can to benefit their customers because they value their reputation. And farms in particular, especially family farms, they particularly value their reputation and their brand. These are things that have been in the family for years. Anyway, in 1906, the federal government passed the Food and Drug Administration. Now, at that time, it didn't do much with agriculture, although it did get involved in the processing of agricultural products. In fact, one of the incentives to create it was a book by a Marxist, a guy named Upton Sinclair, who wrote this book describing his version of what was going on in the meatpacking industry. The meatpacking industry was a blessing. It made it possible for people in cities to have fresh meat. And there was a whole processing involved. And he wrote this book claiming that they were just, like every Marxist, that the meatpacking industry was just poisoning its customers, poisoning it and murdering its employees, and it needed the government to get involved. It was a complete fraud. And Theodore Roosevelt, who was president at the time, knew it was a fraud. But he used it as an argument to have the FDA established. I'm not exaggerating, by the way. But the real destruction that happened to the agricultural business, it was two steps. First of all, in 1913, the Fed was created. Prior to that, all money in the country was all paper money was generated by banks. It was private. The federal government was not involved. And under the Constitution, the federal government's not allowed to be involved. The Constitution is very clear. It specifies all the actual powers of the federal government, and the 9th and 10th Amendments are very clear, saying any power not delegated to the federal government in the Constitution, which is where it's created and where all its powers are delegated, it doesn't exist in the federal government. It remains with the people or the states. Constitution is a contract between the people and the states. And those two amendments, which Jefferson demanded be put in there for that very purpose, make very clear that if the federal government is not given a power specified, and they're all specified in Article 1, Section 8, which specifies the type of legislation that Congress is allowed to pass. And if Congress can't pass the legislation, the federal government can't get involved in it. And there's nothing in there about policing the agriculture business in this country. Nothing that says they can dictate prices, nothing that says anything about that. And they knew all about that. They knew that they couldn't do it. That's why when they decided they wanted to regulate and put out of business, but it was just a more extreme form of regulation. In the alcohol business, they had to pass a constitutional amendment to do it. And they knew that. And that's how they passed the 18th Amendment, which caused incredible problems for the country. It created a massive criminal industry that hadn't existed before because when you have a product that everybody wants that's outlawed, it's guaranteed that the demand will be met, and because it's outlawed, only criminals can meet the demand. So it subjects the entire population who wants to buy it to a situation where they have to deal with criminals. They literally don't know what they're buying. And in a real market of a product that's not prohibited, decent businesses who care about their reputation can sell it, and there's no criminals involved at all. And the problem with having criminals involved is the worst criminals wipe out the least bad criminals. So you end up with worse and worse criminals involved in the black market. Anyway, the Fed or prohibition outlawed alcohol, and they did the same. They had the same level of control over all food and all drugs beginning in 1906. Now, it wasn't a black market, but in terms of the government power over it, they gave themselves that power in the Food and Drug Act, or it wasn't called that, but they created what is now the FDA. It was called something different back then, but it was the same thing. Anyway, it had limited power over family farms at that time. And by the way, in 1900, there were 6.5 million family farms at a time when the population of the country was about 74 million. By 1933, the population had effectively doubled. There had been a great deal of immigration in the early 20th century before the 1920s. It had really begun in the late 19th century, but it mushroomed in the first 2 decades. And they passed legislation in the 1920s basically cutting it all off because they recognized that this was just too many people for a country to absorb. Anyway, the Fed, which had been created in 1913 unconstitutionally, didn't like the fact that there were people involved in trading stocks in the 1920s. I'm not exaggerating. And what they did was they created the Great Depression. Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz wrote a book in 1963 that proves that was the real cause of the Great Depression. It wasn't the stock manipulation. The stock manipulation is what the Fed looked at and said, oh, we're going to tighten up credit. And what they did when they tightened credit, they destroyed the economy. They made it, because in 1913, when the Fed was created, they basically had a stranglehold. They monopolized the currency, and they basically controlled all the banks. All the banks in the country were completely under the thumb of the Fed beginning in 1913. And they weren't allowed to print their own money. It was just the Fed printing the money. So the Fed was committing one of the actual crimes the federal government's allowed to prosecute under Article 1, Section 8. It was counterfeiting. That's what it was doing. And it's really counterfeiting now, because now it isn't even backed by gold. It was backed by gold, at least to some extent, until Nixon just said, no, we're not going to bother with that anymore. And there has been massive inflation since the 1970s, since Nixon did that. Anyway, in 1929, and at the end of the 1920s and the early 30s, the Fed tightened terribly, and it caused the Great Depression, which substantially reduced demand for everything. I mean, it made everyone poorer. Overall, some people remained wealthy, but overall, and that affected the agricultural business. So agricultural prices dropped. And simultaneous with that, there was also some bad weather, basically a drought. But, the droughts, there's all different droughts. But it harmed the agricultural business terribly, because these small farms depend on credit for the operation of the business, and the lack of credit made it impossible for them to deal with the drought. And so you have this chain of events where the Fed cuts off credit, small farms are greatly hurt, and there happened to be bad weather, a drought at that time. It wasn't the worst drought in history, but anyway, it caused big problems. It's called the Dust Bowl, because they couldn't deal with the drought. And so you had this terrible problem. Anyway, ultimately all caused by the Fed tightening credit, because the demand for agricultural products also was reduced, even though people obviously still have to eat. They didn't want to pay the same amount of money because everybody was poor. Anyway, in 1933, as part of the New Deal legislation, the Agricultural Adjustment Act was passed. That was the single most destructive thing in history. Although in 1939, when Henry Morgenthau, who had been FDR's Treasury Secretary, testified about the whole New Deal to the Senate, he said the whole thing was a disaster. It didn't do anything that they promised it would do. It didn't reduce unemployment, and all they did was spend a lot of money, and they constricted the economy for 10 years. They made it the Great Depression. It started out as it would have been a recession, but their ways of affecting it made it even worse. And there's lots of New Deal legislation. It's still here. Anyway, the effect of that 1933 legislation was so destructive. The number of farms, which was basically, it had grown from about 6 million to 6.5 million between 1900 and 1933. With the compliance requirements of that crazy act, small farms were basically wiped out, and the number of farms in the country declined dramatically, so that today there's about 2.5 million. That's an improvement over what it was in 1970. By 1970, even though the population had gone from 74 million in 1900 to about 124 million in 1933, and then now it's like 333 million. So it's 4 times what the population was. You'd expect there'd be 4 times as many farms. In fact, the number of farms went from 6.5 million to today's 2.5 million, and it had dropped to that, basically to 2 million by 1950. And it's basically stayed there because the destruction was done. And what this act does, I won't go into the details of it. It's totally crazy. It's all based on the Marxist idea that the government can improve the economy and that farmers are not going to take care of their own business. And what it does is it imposes all these rules on what farmers are allowed to sell, and every stage of the production. They have to get licenses of all different kinds. And the effect of this is small farms. And I want to let you know that the productivity, there was huge improvements in farm technology from 1900 to today. Enormous. Basically everything, they can get about 6 times, well, between 4 and 6 times the amount per acre in terms of productivity of the land. And there's just been all kinds of improvements, machinery, seed improvements. It's incredible. So that in theory, if you had the same size farm today, you could get 5 times the production and make 5 times as much money with the same amount of land as you could in 1900. But no, small farms have been wiped out by these regulations. The only ones that can comply with them are great big agribusiness. And there's also all these subsidies in there. So there's money that gets passed around, money that gets paid, which creates a constituency which wants this legislation to continue. The only ones who have benefited from that horrible 1933 legislation are big farms, and I mean big corporate farms. Small farms have been wiped out. The number in 1930, about 7% of the population was involved in farming. Today, it's less than 1%. It's about 0.6%. Because all these family farms have been wiped out. And what it is today, there are all these things that farms could do that they're not allowed to do without complying with all kinds of regulations that make it impossible. And this denies citizens, they call us consumers. And they do this all, by the way, in the name of protecting us and protecting the environment and improving the farms. And it does exactly the opposite. No one has greater incentive to protect the environment of his land than the landowner. And that's who the farmer is. They don't need the government telling them what to do with their own land to protect the environment. They have every incentive to do it, and they have their reputation. So that all of the reasons for doing this are crazy. Anyway, they call us consumers. What they do is they prevent us from buying all sorts of things from farms. Like family farms could create could have their own butcher arrangements. They could sell special grass-fed meat, and all sorts of things that they could do that basically the regulations make it impossible for them to do, even if they get involved in a co-op. And it makes everything much more expensive. But they could do things like jams, all sorts of things that they can't do. They could bake things. And all that stuff in the supermarket that comes from Italy, the different types of sausage and meats, our farmers could be producing stuff like that. But they can't. They don't let them. We could be buying incredible food from the farmers here, if you wanted organic food. That's a whole small industry. They call this artisanal farming. basically they can't do it because of the regulations imposed on them with the Agricultural Adjustment Act from 1933. It's still there. And the only ones who benefit are lawyers and lobbyists and big farms. $32 billion a year is spent paying off it all goes to big farms. It doesn't go to small farmers. And it pays them to do things like not grow. It's totally crazy. And they've been doing stuff like that since the 1930s, literally paying people not to grow, not to use their land. And all sorts of stupid stuff, all based on the Marxist premise that farmers want to harm their customers. And it supposedly is for our health. Well, guess how many people were injured by food-carried illnesses last year? About 48 million. And it's been constant of 48 million every year, of which hundreds of thousands end up having to be hospitalized and 3,000 or more die. So that tells you how effective, because the government bureaucrats can't fulfill any of the promises. It's just like all Marxist promises. They promise that they're going to have all this stuff for free for us, and they promise they're going to end all what they call public health problems. The reality is there is no such thing as public health. Health is an inherently private thing, and nothing would be better for our health than being able to buy produce and other things from farms that produce it locally and that are able to sell it. And that act still makes it basically impossible for them to do that. It limits what's available to us, and it does it in the name of health and the environment, and it doesn't even, and in helping farms. You can see how much they help farms. The number went from 6.5 million farms in 1933, when this law was passed, to 2 million by 1950. Now it's gone up slightly to 2.5 million, mostly because there are some artisanal organic farms that have come up that have to fight with these regulations. If the regulations were eliminated, if that whole act was repealed, it would benefit everybody except corrupt businesses that benefit from it, the big agribusinesses, lawyers and lobbyists. It would reduce the number of people with their hands in the tax trough in Washington, because it would wipe out that whole business. And there's a whole industry in Washington of soaking the agriculture department for benefits for corporations. It's absolutely despicable. And the real reason it doesn't get repealed is because it's impossible to repeal legislation in America, because the Senate makes it that way. The Senate has unconstitutionally, as I've shown before, adopted the filibuster rule, which requires a 60-vote supermajority to repeal any legislation. And that's completely contrary to the guarantee clause of the Constitution, which guarantees us a Republican form of government. And the meaning of the word Republican form of government, when that was passed in 1789, was majority rule by the Senate of everything except for very specific things. In the Federalist Papers, where the writers of the Constitution were writing, it was Madison and Hamilton primarily, where they were writing to get people to want to adopt the Constitution, they went to great lengths to justify the very few votes, things like override for the president to override a congressional veto, takes a supermajority. That was a deviation from the Republican form of government. What the Senate has done with that stupid filibuster rule is they've made the general rule a violation of the Republican form of government, because they have to get 60 votes, which means they have to get the votes of the minority, the defeated minority. And that makes it impossible to get anything repealed. And that's the main reason, the political reason, why that terrible legislation, all the New Deal legislation is still there. It all stinks. And the worst part of it for everybody, this really affects everyone, because it's not just the farmers who got put out of business. It affects us as customers. We're missing out on buying great food from farmers that small farmers could produce. They can't sell raw milk as a practical matter. There's cheeses they could create that they can't sell. And the pork in the country, it's all owned by one big company that happens to be owned by the Chinese Communist Party. Small farms could produce hogs that are still good. Try to buy pork chops that aren't tough as leather in the supermarket. They're not available anymore, because what they've done is they've taken all the fat out of the pigs. They've raised pigs to not have fat. and they're all raised in the same place. There's one company that produces practically all the pork in the country, and it's owned by the Chinese Communist Party. And that would all be changed if local farmers could have small herds of swine, and they could have their own herds of cattle, have them grass-fed. They could have specialty stuff available for us. So we're missing out on that. You have to go to specialty food stores to even find anything remotely like that. And most of it comes from Europe, where they're still allowed to do stuff like that. I'm Cliff Ribner, and I hope you like this video. And if you do, please so indicate. And please look at my website, cliffordribner.com, and my book, Freedom's Last Stand. Thank you.